As the season winds down, there will be a debate on the RSUMS of the potential playoff teams versus what we actually see with our eyes. The eye test doesn't mean much if not looked at objectively, and the committee has a big task on its hands, especially if another chaotic weekend unfolds over the course of the conference championship games. Let's compare the RSUMS of the top 4 teams in this week's power rankings. Clemson. Best wins: Auburn, Virginia Tech, bad loss, Syracuse. Clemson has been stacking quality wins all season, capping things off with a destruction of South Carolina on Saturday. The loss to Syracuse is very bad, and the excuse that quarterback Kelly Bryant played hurt before leaving with a concussion doesn't cover for it entirely. Still, the Tigers are in great shape to make another appearance in the playoff and become the first repeat champion since Alabama in 201,112. Oklahoma. Best wins: Ohio State, TCU, Oklahoma State, bad loss, Iowa State. The Sooners and their top-ranked defense could put up 45 points on any of these teams, so their defense could be the difference between another disappointing ending in a championship. The sting of the Iowa State loss in October has returned after the Cyclones closed the season by losing 3 of their last 4. Wisconsin. Best win: Michigan, bad losses, none. It's not Wisconsin's fault that its schedule has been less than stellar. Its place sometimes is hard to look at too, but the Badgers have beaten every team in front of them, so that has to count for something. This point becomes moot if they beat Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. Auburn. Best wins: Georgia, Alabama, bad losses, none. The Tigers boast 2 of the best wins of the season in defeating 2 teams that were ranked at the top of the playoff rankings at the time they came to Jordan-Hare Stadium. Auburn also has lost to Clemson and LSU, the latter after blowing a 20-point lead on the road. Again, it means nothing if the Tigers beat Georgia again on Saturday. Now on to this week's power rankings. 1. Oklahoma, 101.71 Big 12, previous ranking. 2. This week, beat West Virginia, 5,931. Next week, Big 12 championship versus TCU. Baker Mayfield came off the bench after not starting the game because of his antics last week and threw for 281 yards and 3 touchdowns, all but sealing up the Heisman Trophy in the process. Kyler Murray got the start in place of Mayfield and threw for a touchdown and ran for 80 yards for the Sooners, who scored each time they had the ball in the first half. Oklahoma had 646 yards of offense, its 7th time this season having 600 or more yards in a game. 2. Clemson, 111.71 ACC, previous ranking. 3. This week, beat South Carolina, 3,410. Next week, ACC championship versus Miami. Clemson racked up another quality win on the road, this time dispatching South Carolina. Kelly Bryant had 272 yards passing and 2 touchdowns to Hunter Renfrow to put the Tigers in line to make a 3rd straight trip to the playoff. Clemson had 469 total yards and held South Carolina to 81 yards rushing and 10 first downs. 3. Wisconsin, 120.90 Big 10, previous ranking. 5. This week, beat Minnesota, 310. Next week, Big Ten championship versus Ohio State. Alex Hornibrook threw 3 touchdown passes and Jonathan Taylor ran for 149 yards as Wisconsin kept its tight grip on Paul Bunyan's axe with a dominant performance over Minnesota. The Gophers could only manage 133 yards and 8 first downs all day and attempted only 9 passes. 4. Auburn, 102.71 SEC, previous ranking. 6. This week, beat Alabama, 2,614. Next week, SEC Championship versus Georgia. Auburn is the nation's only team to beat 2-1 teams. Does that mean it's the nation's the best team? Absolutely not. There is still a 2 in the loss column for Auburn. But make no mistake about it. The Tigers dominated an Alabama squad that in previous years routinely took the heart out of teams. Jarrett Stidham had 237 yards passing and the Tigers ran the ball for 168 yards on the nation's leader in total and scoring defense. 5. Georgia, 111. 71 SEC. Previous ranking. 7. This week. Beat Georgia Tech, 387. Next week. SEC Championship versus Auburn. Georgia outrushed Georgia Tech's triple option offense, and true freshman Jake Fromm threw for 224 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Bulldogs now must avenge their loss to Auburn 3 weeks ago to make the playoff. 6. Alabama, 111. 71 SEC. Previous ranking. 1. This week. Lost to Auburn, 2,614. Next week. Regular season over. Bowl game TBA. Alabama better hope that the committee thinks back to last season, when Ohio State made the playoff despite winning neither its division nor conference. The simple mistakes the Crimson Tide made, the way they were dominated on both sides of the ball at times, were jarring rarities. Alabama's RSUM will be under the microscope this week. 7. Ohio State, 102. 81 Big Ten. Previous ranking. 8. This week. Beat Michigan, 3,120. Next week. Big Ten Championship versus Wisconsin. Dwayne Haskins came off the bench to replace an injured J.T. Barrett and completed 6 of his 7 passes for 94 yards to extend Ohio State's domination of Michigan. Barrett hurt his knee in the third quarter and did not return. But running back J.K. Dobbins helped pick up the slack with 101 yards and a touchdown. Barrett said after the game he will be good to go against Wisconsin. 8. Central Florida, 110. 80 AAC. Previous ranking. 10. This week. Beat South Florida, 4,942. Next week. AAC Championship versus Memphis. In a game that packed as much action into the last 5 minutes as you will see in some full-length games all year, Central Florida inched closer to a New Year's Six berth with an exciting victory over rival USF. The Knights scored 21 points in the fourth quarter, capped off by a Mike Hughes 95-yard kickoff return for a touchdown with 1:28 left. Mackenzie Milton completed 29 of 44 passes for 373 yards with 4 touchdowns and an interception, and also ran for 56 yards and a touchdown. 9. Miami, 101. 71 ACC. Previous ranking. 4. This week. Lost to Pittsburgh, 2,414. Next week. ACC Championship versus Clemson. 2 takeaways and just 232 yards of offense weren't enough to counter the role Pitt freshman quarterback Kenny Pickett was on. Also, the hint of desperation to save a perfect season came through when starting quarterback Malik Rosier was benched briefly in the fourth quarter. Miami has one more chance to impress the committee but needs to beat Clemson, probably convincingly, to even have a chance. 10. USC, 102. 81 Pac-12. Previous ranking. 11. This week. Off. Next week. Pac-12 Championship versus Stanford. The Trojans' week off should bode well for their conference title tilt against Stanford. There is virtually no scenario or realistic possibility where the Trojans could merit playoff consideration, but they've closed strong after a shaky start. 11. Penn State, 102. 72 Big Ten. Previous ranking. 12. Last week. Beat Maryland, 663. Next week. regular season over, bowl game TBA. Penn State has to be shaking its head wondering what might have been this season. The Nittany Lions could be in the playoff conversation if they hadn't blown a big lead to Ohio State and failed to stop the pass the next week against Michigan State. The balance of Penn State's season makes it more than worthy of a New Year's Six bowl. 12. TCU 102-72 Big 12. Previous ranking 13. This week, beat Baylor 4,522. Next week, Big 12 Championship versus Oklahoma. The Horned Frogs have earned their rematch with Oklahoma in the Big 12 title game. Baylor hung with TCU for a half but could not sustain drives or momentum and turn the ball over at critical times. One thing is for sure. To beat the Sooners, TCU is going to have to run the ball better than it did against Baylor. 13. Washington 102-72 Pac-12. Previous ranking 14. This week, beat Washington State 4,114. Next week, regular season over, bowl game TBA. There is nothing like ruining a rival's chance at a championship. The Apple Cup wasn't much of a contest, as the Huskies ripped apart Washington State, denying the Cougars a chance to play for the Pac-12 title. Myles Gaskin ran for 192 yards and 4 touchdowns and needed very little from Jake Browning in the rout. Washington's defense dominated from the outset, forcing 4 turnovers and sacking Luke Falk 5 times. 14. Memphis 101-71 AAC. Previous ranking 15. This week, beat East Carolina 7,013. Next week, AAC Championship versus Central Florida. The Tigers jumped out to a 281st quarter lead, and all thoughts of Memphis possibly looking ahead to the AAC Championship game went out the window early. Riley Ferguson threw for 299 yards on only 9 completions and added 3 touchdown passes in only 2 quarters of work. 15. Stanford 93-72 Pac-12. Previous ranking 17. This week, beat Notre Dame 3,820. Next week, Pac-12 Championship versus USC. Stanford turned a close game into a runaway in the fourth quarter when 2 Notre Dame turnovers led directly to 14 points. Quarterback K.J. Costello played the game of his life, throwing 4 touchdowns, and Bryce Love ran for 125 yards on an injured ankle. The Cardinals closed the season winning 8 of their final 9 games after starting the season 12-16. Notre Dame 93. Previous ranking 9. This week, lost to Stanford 3,820. Next week, regular season over, bowl game TBA. Notre Dame's hopes of making a major bowl took a major hit when the Irish decided to start turning the ball over on the farm. Josh Adams was held in check, rushing for only 49 yards, and Brandon Wimbush was picked off twice. Losers of 2 of their final 3 games, the Irish will likely find their footing near the top of the ACC's bowl pecking order. 17. LSU 9-3, 62 SEC. Previous ranking 20. This week, beat Texas A&M 4,521. Next week, regular season over, bowl game TBA. Just 2 months ago, the LSU faithful were calling for Ed Orgeron's job after a home loss to Troy. On Saturday, Orgeron got to send Texas A&M coach Kevin Sumlin off on a sour note. Quarterback Danny Etling passed for 347 yards and 3 touchdowns for LSU, which outgained A&M 601,282. 18. Virginia Tech 93-53 ACC. Previous ranking 18. This week, beat Virginia 100. Next week, regular season over, bowl game TBA. Virginia Tech held Virginia to 5 yards rushing in, locking down a 14th consecutive win in the lopsided in-state series. Deshaun McClease and Stephen Peoples each had 71 yards rushing for Virginia Tech, which was held back by the ground game earlier this fall. The Hokies are going bowling for the 25th consecutive year. 19. Oklahoma State, 93. 63 Big 12. Previous ranking, 21. Last week, beat Kansas, 5,817. Next week, regular season over. Bowl game TBA. Mason Rudolph padded his nation-leading passing stats by throwing for 438 yards with 2 touchdowns, and also ran for 2 scores against Kansas, which has now lost 45 straight on the road. The Cowboys' November fate effectively removed them from any significant postseason discussion. 20. Michigan State, 93. 72 Big 10. Previous ranking, 22. Last week, beat Rutgers, 407. Next week, regular season over. Bowl game TBA. Rutgers possessed the ball for a grand total of 12-10 and was held to 5 first downs and 112 total yards, as the Spartans forced 3 turnovers in a season-ending rout. Quarterback Brian Lewerke capped an encouraging regular season with 222 yards passing and 56 rushing while accounting for 2 touchdowns. 21. Northwestern, 93. 72 Big 10. Previous ranking, 25. This week, beat Illinois, 427. Next week, regular season over. Bowl game TBA. Justin Jackson eclipsed 1,000 rushing yards for the 4th straight season, and the Wildcats won their 7th straight game, Northwestern's longest winning streak in over 2 decades. The Wildcats rushed for 306 yards against Illinois, who finished the season on a 10-game losing streak. 22. Washington State, 93. 63 Pac-12. Previous ranking, 16. Last week, lost to Washington, 4,114. Next week, regular season over. Bowl game TBA. Washington State was pretty easy to figure out this season. It played great at home and failed to show up consistently on the road, getting blown out in its 3 losses, all away from Pullman. Luke Falk threw for 369 yards, most of those coming when the game was well in hand. But it was his 3 interceptions that spelled doom for the Cougars, who lost this rivalry game for the 5th straight season. 23. South Florida, 92. 62 AAC. Previous ranking, 23. Last week, lost Central Florida, 4,942. Next week, regular season over. Bowl game TBA. It's certainly WASNT Quentin Flowers' fault his team came up short against UCF. Flowers had 503 yards passing, 102 yards rushing and 5 total touchdowns. But it was the special teams that let the Bulls down at the end, allowing a kickoff return for a touchdown immediately after tying the score with less than 2 minutes left. 24. Mississippi State, 84. 44 SEC. Previous ranking, 19. This week, lost to Ole Miss, 3,128. Next week, regular season over. Bowl game TBA. Freshman Keaton Thompson came on in relief for injured starting quarterback Nick Fitzgerald and nearly rallied the Bulldogs back from an 18-point fourth-quarter deficit in the Egg Bowl. Thompson had 195 yards passing and 121 yards rushing on 26 carries. The victory for Ole Miss made the Rebels' season and tainted the Bulldogs before Thanksgiving night. All of Mississippi State's losses had come to the sex elites. 25. Fresno State, 92. 70 MWC. Previous ranking. This week, beat Boise State, 2,817. Next week, Mountain West Championship vs. Boise State, in part 1 of a 2-part series. Fresno State used a stout defensive effort to hold the Broncos to a season low in points. Fresno State quarterback Marcus McMaryion threw for a season-high 332 yards and 2 touchdowns. Neither team could establish much on the ground, averaging 3.5 yards per rush. Out. Boise State. Maybe next week. Florida Atlantic. San Diego State. Boise State.